Before we go any further into what you should do differently, we need to slow this down and talk about what you're actually dealing with, because here's the truth. If you misidentify the problem, you will misapply the solution. And that's exactly what so many intelligent, kind, capable people do when they're entangled with a narcissist. You think you're dealing with someone who is insecure or stressed or wounded. You think if you love them better, communicate more clearly, explain yourself more patiently, or stay calm enough, eventually they'll get it. Eventually they'll soften. Eventually they'll see you. But narcissism doesn't operate in the same emotional universe as you. At its core, narcissism isn't simply arrogance. It's not just selfishness. It's a deeply entrenched pattern built around fragility, entitlement, and an insatiable need for validation. Everything revolves around maintaining a very carefully constructed self-image. And anything that threatens that image becomes the enemy. That includes you. Now, this is where people get confused. Because narcissists can be charming, magnetic, generous in bursts. They can look confident, even powerful. But underneath that exterior is a structure that cannot tolerate shame, criticism, or loss of control. And rather than process those feelings internally like a psychologically healthy person would, they regulate them externally through dominance, manipulation, blame shifting, and control. So when you are nice, when you accommodate, when you over-explain, when you give them the benefit of the doubt again and again, what you believe you're doing is nurturing connection. What they often experience is reinforcement of power. If they lash out and you apologize just to calm things down, they learn that intimidation works. If they give you the silent treatment and you chase after them to repair things, they learn that withdrawal gives them leverage. If they criticize you and you try harder to prove yourself, they learn that devaluation increases your effort. Do you see the pattern? You are playing by the rules of empathy. They are playing by the rules of control. And until you truly understand that difference, you will keep exhausting yourself trying to win a game that was never designed for fairness. A narcissistic personality structure is organized around one central drive: maintaining superiority and avoiding shame, not intimacy, not reciprocity, not mutual growth, superiority, and the avoidance of shame at all costs. So when you offer constructive feedback, they don't hear collaboration, they hear attack. When you express hurt, they don't hear vulnerability, they hear accusation. When you ask for accountability, they don't feel responsible. They feel exposed, and exposure feels intolerable. So what happens? They deflect, they project, they rewrite history, they minimize your experience, they escalate, they may even punish you emotionally, because protecting their ego is more important than protecting the relationship. Now, here's the part that can be hard to swallow. This pattern is stable. It's not situational. It's not something that disappears because you found the perfect wording. It's not something that dissolves because you were patient enough. People with strong narcissistic traits don't operate from a place of mutual empathy. Their empathy is selective and often self-serving. Their apologies, if they come, are frequently strategic. Their warmth can be conditional, and their kindness can evaporate the moment they feel challenged. And if you don't understand this, you'll keep personalizing their behavior. You'll think, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. Maybe if I stayed calmer. Maybe if I were more supportive. You start adjusting yourself in 1,000 small ways. And over time, you become smaller. That's not love. That's erosion. Understanding narcissism is not about labeling someone casually. It's about recognizing patterns: chronic blame shifting, entitlement, lack of accountability, emotional volatility when criticized, exploitation of others for validation, and a consistent need to dominate the narrative. When you step back and look at the pattern, not the promises, not the charming phases, not the occasional good days, but the pattern, you begin to see that niceness alone cannot solve this, because niceness assumes mutual goodwill, and narcissism is not built on mutual goodwill. It's built on hierarchy. You are either affirming the hierarchy or you are threatening it. That's why your kindness doesn't melt them. It often positions you beneath them. That's why your patience doesn't inspire gratitude. It can inspire entitlement. That's why your attempts at deep emotional conversation can be met with defensiveness or mockery. You are offering vulnerability. They are calculating power. Now, I want to be clear, understanding this is not about becoming cynical or cold. It's not about diagnosing everyone who hurts you. It's about clarity. Because clarity is power. When you understand the structure you were dealing with, you stop trying to fix it with the wrong tools. You stop trying to negotiate with someone who sees compromise as weakness. You stop trying to earn respect from someone who equates respect with dominance. And perhaps most importantly, you stop blaming yourself. You begin to see that the cycle you're in isn't happening because you are unlovable, inadequate, or flawed. It's happening because you are applying empathy to a system that exploits empathy. That awareness alone shifts something profound inside you. Instead of asking, how can I be nicer so they won't react this way? You begin asking, why am I adjusting myself to accommodate chronic disrespect? That's the pivot point. Because once you truly understand the psychology, once you internalize that this is about control and ego protection, not about your failure to communicate properly, you become less confused. And confusion is one of the strongest tools narcissistic dynamics rely on. When the fog clears, the dynamic becomes visible. And when the dynamic becomes visible, you stop trying to win their approval and start protecting your own stability. That is where real change begins. You cannot change a narcissist by being nicer, but you can change your strategy by understanding exactly who you're standing across from. And the moment you see the game clearly, you stop playing it blindly. Once you truly understand what you're dealing with, the next shift is uncomfortable, but absolutely necessary. You have to stop rewarding the very behaviors that are hurting you. And I know that sounds harsh because most of you are not thinking I'm rewarding this. You're thinking I'm trying to keep the peace. You're thinking I don't want another fight. You're thinking if I just handle this calmly, maybe it won't escalate, but let's slow that down. In any relationship dynamic, behavior that gets reinforced tends to repeat. This isn't complicated psychology. It's basic human learning. When something works, we keep doing it. And in narcissistic dynamics, Mike's manipulation works not because you're weak, not because you're foolish, but because you're empathetic. If they explode and you back down, the explosion worked. If they sulk and withdraw and you chase them to fix it, the withdrawal worked. If they insult you and you try harder to please them, the insult worked. And that is the part we rarely say out loud. Every time you over-accommodate in response to mistreatment, you are teaching them how to treat you. Now, I want you to notice something. Narcissistic individuals are highly attuned to power shifts. They may not be emotionally attuned in a reciprocal way, but they are exquisitely sensitive to leverage. They watch what makes you react. They watch what makes you anxious. They watch what makes you try harder. And once they identify those pressure points, they use them. So when you over-explain yourself for hours trying to prove your innocence in an argument that was never about truth to begin with, you are investing emotional labor into a game that was rigged from the start. They weren't seeking clarity. They were seeking dominance. When you apologize just to calm the storm, even when you did nothing wrong, you may feel temporary relief. The house gets quiet, the tension drops, but what just happened beneath the surface? The message that was sent is escalation gets compliance and compliance becomes expectation. This is why being the bigger person in a narcissistic dynamic often backfires. In healthy relationships, generosity builds goodwill. In narcissistic dynamics, generosity can build entitlement. Let me say that again because it's important. In a healthy system, compromise strengthens the bond. In a narcissistic system, compromise can signal weakness. Now, that doesn't mean you become combative. It doesn't mean you start mirroring cruelty. It means you stop cushioning the consequences of their behavior. For example, if they forget something important to you and you respond by saying, it's okay, I know you're busy, even though you're hurt, you've just absorbed the emotional cost for them. They don't have to sit with the discomfort of having disappointed you. You carried it instead. If they speak to you disrespectfully in public and later you tell yourself they were stressed, you've rationalized it. And when there's no meaningful consequence, emotional distance, calling it out calmly, refusing to engage, the behavior settles in as acceptable. Many of you in this room are incredibly skilled at emotional labor. You smooth things over, you anticipate moods, you adjust your tone, you monitor their reactions, you become hypervigilant peacekeepers. And I want you to gently ask yourself, who is doing that for you? In narcissistic relationships, there is often a one-way flow of accommodation. You bend, they remain rigid, you analyze your tone, they justify theirs, you lose sleep replaying conversations, they sleep soundly, convinced they were right. When you continually step in to manage their emotions, you prevent them from ever having to manage their own. When you repeatedly rescue the relationship from the consequences of their behavior, you protect them from accountability. And accountability is precisely what threatens their fragile self-concept. So they learn something very quickly. If I push hard enough, they will fold. This is why the cycle escalates over time. What once required mild criticism may eventually require harsher devaluation. What once required subtle guilt tripping may evolve into overt rage. Because tolerance builds, the bar moves. And here's the painful paradox. The kinder you are in response to mistreatment, the more confused you become about why it continues. You think, I've been so patient. I've been understanding. I've given them chance after chance. Yes, you have. And from your perspective, that should inspire gratitude and growth. But from a narcissistic perspective, it signals that the behavior is survivable. It doesn't cost them the relationship. It doesn't cost them access to you. It doesn't cost them admiration or support. So why would it stop? Stopping the reward does not mean dramatic confrontation. It often looks quieter than that. It means not over-explaining. It means not apologizing when you've done nothing wrong. It means allowing silence to exist without scrambling to fix it. It means letting their discomfort be theirs. When they attempt to bait you into a circular argument, you don't enter the ring. When they provoke you for a reaction, you don't supply the fuel. When they cross a line, you calmly state that it's not acceptable, and you don't dilute that message with nervous laughter or excessive justification. This shift can feel terrifying at first because you've been conditioned to believe that maintaining harmony is your responsibility. When you stop over-functioning, the system shakes. There may be backlash. There may be escalation. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the old reinforcement pattern is being disrupted. And disruption feels threatening to someone who relies on control. But here's what begins to happen over time. When their usual tactics stop producing the same emotional payoff, they either escalate further, revealing the pattern more clearly, or they adjust their behavior slightly because the reward is no longer automatic. Either way, you gain clarity, and clarity is stabilizing. You begin to realize that you are not obligated to sacrifice your dignity to maintain proximity. You are not required to self-abandon to avoid someone else's anger. You are not responsible for absorbing the emotional consequences of someone else's immaturity. When you stop rewarding manipulation, you stop participating in it. That is not cruelty. That is self-respect. And here's the truth I want you to carry with you. Every time you over-accommodate disrespect, you shrink. Every time you hold the line calmly, you expand. And the moment you stop cushioning bad behavior is the moment the dynamic begins to change. Once you stop rewarding the behavior, the next step is where many people freeze. Because now we're talking about boundaries. And boundaries sound simple in theory, but in a narcissistic dynamic, they can feel terrifying. Let's be honest about why. If you've been in this pattern for a while, you already know what happens when you push back. You've seen the rage, the sulking, the silent treatment, the guilt tripping, the twisting of your words. So somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned it's safer not to set limits. But here's the reality. The absence of boundaries doesn't create safety. It creates slow erosion. A boundary is not a threat. It's not a lecture. It's not a dramatic declaration. It is a clear statement of what is acceptable to you and what you will do if that line is crossed. Notice I said what you will do, not what they must do. This is where people get it wrong. They think a boundary is you need to stop speaking to me like that. That's a request. A boundary is if you continue speaking to me like that, I will end this conversation. That's ownership. With narcissistic individuals, requests often invite debate. Boundaries require action. And here's why this matters. Narcissistic personalities are deeply resistant to being controlled, but they are highly motivated by maintaining control. So the moment you frame something as you need to change, you activate their defensiveness. But when you calmly state what you will or won't participate in, you remove yourself from the power struggle. You are no longer trying to control them. You are controlling your access. That is a very different posture. Now let's talk about consistency, because this is the piece that determines whether a boundary works. You can deliver the most eloquent, grounded statement in the world, but if you don't follow through, the system resets. If you say, I won't tolerate being yelled at, and then you stay in the room while they yell, the boundary dissolves. If you say, if you insult me, I will leave, and then you stay because you feel guilty, the message becomes negotiable, and narcissistic individuals are highly attuned to negotiation. They test, they probe, they look for cracks, not always consciously in a villainous way, but structurally, they are wired to see how far they can go without losing supply, admiration, or access. If your limits are porous, they will expand into that space. This is why boundaries must be calm and boring, not emotional, not dramatic, not delivered in the heat of rage. The more emotionally charged the boundary, the more it becomes fuel. A narcissistic person may then pivot the conversation to your tone, your intensity, your overreaction. But when a boundary is delivered neutrally, I'm not going to engage in this conversation if it continues this way. And then you actually disengage, something shifts. You're not fighting, you're not persuading, you're not pleading, you're opting out, and opting out is powerful. Now, I want to acknowledge something important. When you first begin setting boundaries in a narcissistic dynamic, you will likely see escalation. This is called extinction burst. When a behavior that used to work stops working, the person often intensifies it temporarily. If yelling used to get you to fold, they may yell louder. If guilt used to make you stay, they may intensify the guilt. If charm used to reel you back in, the love bombing might increase. This is not proof that your boundary failed. It's proof that the old system is being challenged. Your job during that escalation is not to match it. It is to remain consistent. Boundaries are not about changing them. They are about stabilizing you. And this is the internal shift that must happen. If you're setting boundaries secretly hoping they will finally understand your worth and transform into a different person, you will be disappointed. That expectation pulls you back into the approval-seeking loop. Instead, boundaries are a declaration to yourself. I am no longer participating in my own diminishment. It might be limiting the length of conversations. It might be refusing to discuss certain topics. It might be declining invitations where, humiliation is likely. It might be moving toward low contact. It might eventually mean no contact. Each of those decisions says my nervous system matters, my dignity matters. And let's talk about guilt for a moment because it shows up fast. Narcissistic individuals are skilled at reframing your boundaries as cruelty. They may say you're selfish, cold, dramatic, unforgiving. They may accuse you of abandoning them or changing, but ask yourself this: were you called selfish when you were overgiving? Were you called cold when you were absorbing their moods? Or do those labels only appear when you stop complying? Guilt is often the last tether keeping you in place. Healthy guilt signals when we've harmed someone. Toxic guilt appears when we've stopped overfunctioning. There is a difference. Setting boundaries does not mean you stop being compassionate. It means your compassion includes yourself. It means you recognize that endless tolerance of mistreatment is not virtue, it's self-abandonment. And here's something that may feel surprising. When you consistently uphold boundaries, even a narcissistic individual learns something. They learn that access to you is conditional on respectful behavior. They may not like it, they may resist it, but the structure becomes clearer, and clarity reduces chaos. Without boundaries, the relationship operates on their moods. With boundaries, it operates on your standards. That doesn't guarantee harmony. It guarantees self-respect. And self-respect changes how you stand, how you speak, how you choose. You stop asking, how do I keep them calm? You start asking, what aligns with my values? You stop negotiating your basic needs. You start protecting them. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience yourself as someone who can hold a line. That internal experience, that sense of steadiness is transformative because narcissistic dynamics thrive in ambiguity. They thrive when the lines are blurry, when you second guess yourself, when you fear rocking the boat. Boundaries draw the line in permanent ink, not loudly, not cruelly, but clearly. And when you consistently stand by that line, something profound happens. You stop waiting for them to change, and you start changing the terms of engagement. And that is where your power begins to solidify. A boundary is not about controlling them. It is about refusing to betray yourself. Once you begin setting boundaries, something else becomes absolutely essential. And this one is subtle. You must learn to detach emotionally, not become cold, not become cruel, but detach. Because here is what many people do when they finally start drawing lines. They draw the boundary and then they emotionally implode when it's challenged. And that emotional reaction, that's the hook. Narcissistic dynamics run on emotional energy. Intensity, drama, high highs, crushing lows, circular arguments that last for hours, tears, raised voices, long text messages explaining your heart, your pain, your intentions. To you, that feels like fighting for the relationship. To them, that feels like supply. It doesn't even matter if the attention is positive or negative. What matters is that they are still the center of you, our emotional world. They are still driving your nervous system. They are still controlling the temperature of the room. Detachment changes that. Now, let me be clear. Detachment is not indifference. It is not pretending you don't care. It is not suppressing your emotions. It is choosing not to perform your emotions in front of someone who weaponizes them. When a narcissistic person provokes you, and they will, the goal is often to destabilize you. If they can get you angry, they can call you irrational. If they can get you crying, they can call you dramatic. If they can get you defending yourself for hours, they can exhaust you. And exhaustion weakens boundaries. So instead of reacting, you respond. And those are two very different things. Reaction is immediate, emotional, charged. It's your nervous system firing before your thinking brain catches up. Response is slower, grounded, intentional. When they say something provocative, instead of launching into a defense, you pause, you breathe, you answer briefly, or sometimes you don't answer at all. You don't need to correct every distortion. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to clarify every misunderstanding that was never a misunderstanding to begin with. You conserve your energy. This is where the concept often called gray rock comes in, becoming emotionally neutral, uninteresting to provoke, offering minimal reaction, short answers, no dramatic engagement. Why does this work? Because if the payoff for provoking you disappears, the behavior loses some of its reinforcement. If every jab no longer results in a theatrical emotional exchange, there's less incentive to keep jabbing. Now I will to prepare you for something. When you begin detaching emotionally, it may feel unnatural, especially if you are someone who values communication and emotional honesty. You might think, but I should express how I feel. And in healthy relationships, yes, absolutely. But in narcissistic dynamics, your emotional transparency often becomes data that can later be used against you, data that can be mocked, minimized, or stored for strategic deployment during conflict. So detachment becomes protection. Instead of explaining why their comment hurt you for the 5th time, you might simply say, I'm not engaging with that, and shift your attention elsewhere. Instead of arguing over a blatant rewrite of history, you might say, we see this differently, and end the discussion. Notice what's happening there. You are not trying to force agreement. You are not begging for validation. You are stepping out of the emotional tug of war, and that tug of war is addictive. Let's talk about that honestly. Narcissistic relationships often create a trauma bond, intermittent reinforcement, moments of affection mixed with criticism, creates a powerful psychological attachment. You find yourself craving the highs after enduring the lows. You become hyper-focused on regaining connection after conflict. So when you detach, part of you may feel withdrawal. It may feel empty. You may feel the urge to re-engage, to provoke a reaction, to fix something just to restore intensity. That urge is not love, it is conditioning. Emotional detachment is how you begin breaking that conditioning. You stop measuring your worth by their mood. You stop allowing their anger to define your day. You stop chasing reassurance from someone who withholds it strategically. Instead, you stabilize yourself internally. When they escalate, you remain steady. When they attempt to bait you, you stay calm. When they accuse, you don't scramble to defend every point. You choose your responses carefully and sparingly. And here's what begins to shift inside you. Your nervous system calms. You sleep better. You ruminate less. The relationship stops feeling like an emotional roller coaster and starts looking like a pattern. Detachment gives you perspective. When you're emotionally fused with someone, every comment feels urgent. Every disagreement feels catastrophic. Every cold moment feels like abandonment. But when you detach, you observe instead of absorb. You start thinking, there's the projection again. There's the deflection. There's the attempt to provoke. You see the behavior without drowning in it. And that observational stance is powerful because you cannot make strategic decisions from a place of emotional flooding. You can only survive from there. Detachment moves you from survival to strategy. It allows you to evaluate, is this sustainable? Is this healthy? Is this aligned with who I want to be? Instead of constantly asking, how do I make this better right now? And let me say something that may feel liberating. You are not obligated to attend every argument you are invited to. Just because they demand engagement does not mean you must provide it. Just because they raise their voice does not mean you must match it. Just because they accuse does not mean you must defend. Silence can be powerful. Brevity can be powerful. Walking away can be powerful. And over time, something remarkable happens. When your emotional reactions decrease, their ability to destabilize you decreases. The dynamic loses intensity, and intensity is the oxygen of narcissistic systems. Now, this does not guarantee they will suddenly become respectful, but it guarantees that your inner world becomes less chaotic. And that matters because when you are no longer emotionally hijacked, you can think clearly. When you can think clearly, you can choose wisely. And when you choose wisely, you begin reclaiming control over your own life. Detachment is not about shutting down your heart. It is about guarding it. It is the quiet decision to stop giving someone the power to dictate your emotional climate. And when you master that, when you respond instead of react, you stop being their emotional fuel. Once you begin detaching emotionally, something else becomes painfully clear: how much of your energy has been spent trying to prove your worth. And this one runs deep because when you're entangled with a narcissistic person, the goalposts are always moving. You think, if I just do this better, if I just show up more consistently, if I just explain myself more clearly, if I just love them harder, they'll finally see me. But here's the trap. The game was never designed for you to win. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on evaluation. You are constantly being measured. Your tone, your loyalty, your attractiveness, your competence, your usefulness. And when you meet one expectation, another quietly replaces it. You cook dinner. It's not seasoned enough. You support their career. You're too focused on your own. You succeed. You're threatening. You struggle. You're inadequate. There is always something slightly off. And what happens? You lean in harder, you try more, you fix yourself, you shrink here, you stretch there, you apologize preemptively, you anticipate criticism before it even lands. You begin living in performance mode. Now let's pause for a moment. In a healthy relationship, love is not something you audition for. Respect is not something you earn through exhaustion. Your worth is not up for review every week, but in a narcissistic system, worth feels conditional. Conditional on admiration, conditional on obedience, conditional on never challenging their superiority. So you start internalizing the belief that if you could just be enough, the chaos would stop. But here's the reality. It doesn't stop because the instability isn't about your adequacy. It's about their need to maintain hierarchy. If you become too confident, it threatens them. If you become too independent, it threatens them. If you outshine them, it threatens them. If you question them, it threatens them. So the criticism continues, not because you are failing, but because keeping you slightly off balance maintains control. When you are trying to prove your worth, you are positioning them as the judge. And that is the dynamic that must end. You are not on trial. But in narcissistic relationships, it feels like you are. Every disagreement becomes a character assessment. Every boundary becomes evidence that you're difficult. Every moment of fatigue becomes proof that you're selfish, and you find yourself defending your humanity. I'm not selfish. I'm not dramatic. I'm not too sensitive. I'm not the problem. Notice how exhausting that is. When you are constantly defending who you are no longer living. You are campaigning, and campaigning is draining. This is why detachment is so critical. Because once you detach emotionally, you begin to see that the evaluation system itself is flawed. The judge is biased. The criteria are inconsistent. The verdict was often predetermined. So why are you still trying to win approval there? Many people stay stuck in this proving cycle because occasionally they get rewarded. A compliment, a warm moment, a flash of admiration, and it feels intoxicating. Finally they see me. But if validation is given sparingly and unpredictably, it becomes addictive. You start chasing it. You start shaping yourself around it. You start believing that those rare good moments are evidence that if you just try a little harder, they'll become permanent. That's intermittent reinforcement at work, and it is powerful. But here's the question I want you to sit with. What if your worth has nothing to do with their perception? What if their inability to consistently value you says more about their fragility than your adequacy? Narcissistic individuals often struggle with envy, not always overtly, sometimes subtly. Your strengths can activate their insecurities. Your independence can highlight their dependence on admiration. Your emotional intelligence can expose their deficits, and instead of celebrating those qualities, they may diminish them, so you shrink to survive. You downplay achievements. You soften opinions. You minimize needs. You edit yourself. You become less so that they feel more, and that is a profound self-betrayal. Peeing the need to prove yourself does not mean becoming arrogant. It means internalizing your worth so deeply that it is no longer negotiable. It means recognizing that no amount of external validation can compensate for internal doubt, and no amount of external criticism can dismantle internal clarity. When you stop trying to prove your worth, your behavior changes. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop chasing reassurance from someone who withholds it strategically. You begin making decisions based on alignment, not approval. And this shift can be disorienting, because for a long time, the relationship may have revolved around earning points. When you stop playing that game, there may be pushback. They may accuse you of changing. They may say you're distant. They may imply you're ungrateful. But ask yourself, were you ever truly secure while trying to prove yourself? Or were you always one misstep away from criticism? The need to prove yourself keeps you tethered to their evaluation system. Releasing that need breaks the tether. And here's something important. When you stop trying to prove your worth, you also stop arguing with every distortion. If they call you selfish for setting a boundary, you don't spiral into an hour-long defense. You know who you are. If they accuse you of being cold for detaching, you don't rush to perform warmth. You know your intentions. Confidence becomes quiet. You don't need to convince them. You don't need to persuade them. You don't need to gather evidence for your goodness. You simply are, and that grounded sense of self is incredibly destabilizing to a narcissistic dynamic. Because if you are no longer seeking validation, their leverage decreases. If you are no longer afraid of disapproval, their criticism loses its sting. You become less reactive, less apologetic, less malleable. You begin to inhabit your own center. And from that center, you can ask a much more important question than, how do I make them see my worth? You can ask, why am I seeking worth from someone who withholds it? That question changes everything, because once you answer it honestly, you realize that your value was never on trial. It was never something they had the authority to grant or revoke. The only person who had to recognize it was you. And the moment you stop auditioning for approval is the moment you reclaim your power. Your worth is not a debate. When you stop trying to prove your worth, another shift becomes possible. And this one is about clarity. You begin to see the tactics. Because up until now, much of your energy may have been spent in confusion, trying to make sense of conversations that left you spinning, trying to reconcile words that didn't match actions, trying to understand how an argument about something small turned into a character assassination. Confusion is not accidental in narcissistic dynamics. It is functional. When you are confused, you hesitate. When you hesitate, you second guess yourself. And when you second guess yourself, you become easier to control. So let's talk about recognizing manipulation clearly and calmly, not dramatically, not obsessively, but with awareness. One of the most common tactics is gaslighting, and I want to be precise here. Gaslighting is not simply disagreement. It is the consistent denial or distortion of reality in a way that makes you question your own perception. You remember a conversation clearly. They tell you it never happened. You express hurt. They tell you you're imagining things. They say something cutting. Later, they insist you misunderstood, or worse, that you're inventing drama. At first, you argue, you bring receipts, you replay texts, you defend your memory. But over time, something erodes. You start thinking, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. That self-doubt is the outcome. Another tactic is projection. They accuse you of exactly what they're doing. If they're being dismissive, suddenly you're the one who's cold. If they're being unfaithful, you're the one who's suspicious and paranoid. If they're lying, you're the one who's untrustworthy. Projection flips the script so quickly that you find yourself defending against accusations that don't even align with your behavior. Then there's blame shifting. No matter what happens, it circles back to you. If they lost their temper, it's because you provoked them. If they forgot something important, it's because you didn't remind them properly. If they're unhappy, it's because you're not supportive enough. Accountability evaporates, and perhaps one of the most destabilizing tactics is intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between affection and devaluation. One day you're cherished, the next you're criticized. One moment they're warm, the next they're withdrawn. That unpredictability keeps you hooked. You chase the good version of them. You try to avoid triggering the bad version. And in that constant adjustment, you lose your footing. When you don't recognize these patterns, you personalize them. You think, if I were better, this wouldn't be happening. But once you recognize the tactics, something shifts internally. You move from what's wrong with me to what is happening here. And that question is powerful because when you name the tactic, it loses some of its fog. When they rewrite history, instead of spiraling into a debate, you think, that's gaslighting. When they accuse you of the very thing they're doing, you think, that's projection. When they turn every issue back onto you, you recognize blame shifting. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to educate them in the moment. In fact, doing so often escalates things. Awareness is for you. Naming the pattern internally gives you distance, and distance reduces confusion. Let me say something very clearly. Narcissistic manipulation is rarely about logic. It's about destabilization. If they can keep you explaining, defending, clarifying, you are engaged on their terms. But once you recognize the tactic, you don't have to chase every twist in the argument. You can step back, you can respond briefly, or you can disengage. This is where emotional detachment and boundaries start working together. When you understand the manipulation, you're less tempted to fight it head on. You don't try to win the argument. You try to preserve your clarity. And clarity is everything because manipulation thrives in ambiguity. It thrives when you feel unsure. When you start trusting your perception again, the dynamic shifts. Now, here's something important. Recognizing manipulation does not mean you become hypervigilant or paranoid. It means you observe patterns over time. Narcissistic traits are not about one bad day or one insensitive comment. They're about consistent patterns of entitlement, lack of empathy, defensiveness, and control. Look at the pattern, not the promise. They may apologize. They may say the right words. They may even acknowledge some wrongdoing. But does the behavior change? Or does the cycle reset? When you step back and evaluate patterns rather than moments, the truth becomes harder to ignore. And that truth can be painful because times recognizing the manipulation means acknowledging that this dynamic is not going to transform into the relationship you hoped for. It means grieving the fantasy of who you thought they could be. But awareness, even when painful, is stabilizing. You stop trying to decode every mixed message. You stop overanalyzing every silence. You stop wondering if you're overreacting to obvious disrespect. You begin trusting your internal compass again. If something feels off consistently, it probably is. If you leave conversations feeling diminished repeatedly, that matters. If you're constantly defending your intentions, that's data. Manipulation loses power when you stop arguing with your own perception. And here's the deeper shift. When you recognize the tactics, you stop being shocked by them. You expect them, not in a cynical way, but in a prepared way. If you know someone tends to project, you're less thrown when accusations come. If you know someone deflects accountability, you're less surprised when responsibility disappears. Predictability reduces emotional impact. You move from confusion to strategy. You think, given this pattern, how do I protect my energy? Given this behavior, what boundaries are necessary, given this cycle, what level of access is healthy. Those are empowered questions. Because once you see the manipulation clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once you stop internalizing it, you stop collapsing under it. You are no longer trying to fix what was never yours to fix. You are no longer trying to make sense of behavior that was never designed to be fair. You are simply observing and choosing accordingly. And that is the moment the fog lifts. When you can name the game, you no longer get lost in it. Clarity is your shield. Once you have clarity, once you can see the manipulation, the patterns, the cycles, the next step becomes less about insight and more about implementation. And this is where many people hesitate, because now we're talking about distance, not dramatic speeches, not emotional ultimatums, not explosive exits. Distance, strategic distance. When you understand narcissistic dynamics, you realize something very important. Access is power. The more access someone has to your time, your emotions, your thoughts, your vulnerabilities, the more influence they have over your nervous system. So if the dynamic is unhealthy, limiting access becomes an act of self-protection. Now, I want to be very clear. Distance doesn't always mean walking out the door tomorrow. Life is complicated. There may be marriages, children, shared finances, workplaces, cultural expectations. Not every situation allows for immediate or total separation, but there are levels of distance, emotional distance, conversational distance, physical distance, digital distance, and in some cases, complete no contact. Let's start with emotional distance, because that often comes first. Emotional distance means you stop sharing your inner world with someone who weaponizes it. You stop disclosing your fears, your dreams, your insecurities to someone who later uses them in arguments. You stop seeking comfort from the very person who destabilizes you. That alone can shift everything. Instead of turning toward them when you're hurt, you turn inward or toward safe people. Instead of asking for validation from someone who holds it, you validate yourself. Instead of processing your deepest concerns with someone who minimizes them, you protect that vulnerability. You become more selective. Then there's conversational distance. You reduce topics that consistently lead to chaos. You stop engaging in circular arguments. You shorten interactions. You respond briefly instead of elaborately. You don't feel obligated to explain every thought. The tone becomes calmer, simpler, less entangled. And here's something many people struggle with. You do not have to announce your distance. You don't need to say, I am now emotionally withdrawing because you have violated my trust. That turns into another argument. Instead, you quietly shift your behavior. You share less, you argue less, you chase less, and watch what happens. When someone senses their control decreasing, they may escalate. They may accuse you of being distant, cold, uncaring. They may try to pull you back in with charm, crisis, or conflict. That's information. Strategic distance reveals the structure of the relationship. If your emotional withdrawal causes panic or manipulation rather than reflection and repair, that tells you something important. Now let's talk about low contact. This often applies when you can't completely remove the person from your life. Perhaps it's a CO parent, a colleague, or a family member. Low contact means interactions are limited to necessary topics, logistics, facts, clear boundaries. You remove personal engagement from the equation. You become businesslike. This reduces drama because you are no longer offering emotional entry points, and then there is no contact. For some people, this becomes the only sustainable option. When the manipulation is severe, when the abuse is chronic, when every interaction destabilizes you, no contact can be life-changing. But I want to say this carefully. No contact is not about punishment. It is about protection. It is the recognition that continued exposure is harmful to your psychological well-being. And here's the difficult truth. Narcissistic individuals rarely respond to distance with humility. More often, they respond with narrative control. They may paint you as the villain. They may recruit others. They may frame your boundaries as cruelty. That can be deeply unsettling. But ask yourself, are you distancing to win public approval, or are you distancing to reclaim your peace? Because you may not get both. Distance requires tolerating misunderstanding. It requires tolerating being mischaracterized. It requires resisting the urge to defend your decision to people who don't see the full picture, and that is hard. But here is what begins to happen when you create space. The constant emotional noise decreases, the hypervigilance softens, you stop scanning for the next mood shift, you stop rehearsing arguments in your head, you stop bracing for impact, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. And in that quieter internal space, you start to remember who you were before the chaos. Your preferences resurface, your humor resurfaces, your confidence resurfaces. You realize how much mental bandwidth was consumed managing someone else's instability. Distance is not just about separating from them, it's about reconnecting with yourself. Now, I know there is fear here, fear of loneliness, fear of retaliation, fear, regret. Fear that maybe you're overreacting, but let me ask you this. If staying close requires constant self-betrayal, is that closeness worth preserving? Strategic distance allows you to observe the relationship from the outside rather than drowning inside it. It gives you perspective, and perspective often clarifies whether repair is possible or whether preservation of self must take priority. And I want to emphasize something. Distance does not require hatred. You don't have to demonize someone to step away from them. You can acknowledge that someone has wounds, that they have struggles, that they have limitations, and still decide that proximity is not healthy for you. Compassion does not require self-sacrifice. In fact, sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself is step back. Because when you remain entangled in a destructive dynamic, you normalize it. For yourself, for your children, for your nervous system. Distance interrupts normalization. It says, this is not acceptable. This is not sustainable. This is not who I want to become. And here's the powerful part. When you reduce access, you reclaim agency. You are no longer waiting for them to change. You are no longer negotiating your dignity. You are making choices aligned with your well-being. That is strength. And yes, it can feel lonely at first. The drama may be gone, but so is the intensity. The chaos may be gone, but so is the familiar pattern. You may feel untethered, but what you're actually experiencing is detox. Over time, that quiet becomes peace. And peace, even if unfamiliar at first, is stabilizing. When you create distance from someone who thrives on control, you remove yourself from the battlefield, and you cannot be manipulated from a distance you refuse to close. Sometimes the most powerful move is not confrontation. It's stepping back. Access is privilege, not entitlement. Once you've created distance, whether emotional, conversational, or physical, something very important happens. The silence gets louder, and in that silence, you start to feel everything you've been suppressing, because surviving a narcissistic dynamic requires a tremendous amount of adaptation. You become hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, you monitor moods, you anticipate reactions, you rehearse conversations in your head, you analyze every shift in tone, you override your intuition in the name of keeping things stable. And when you finally stop doing that, when you step back and the chaos quiets down, your body begins to exhale. But along with that exhale comes grief. Grief for the relationship you hoped it would be. Grief for the version of them you kept waiting for. Grief for the version of yourself that tolerated so much. This is where the real work begins, because stopping the dynamic is one thing. Healing from it is another. Narcissistic relationships often erode something very specific, your trust in yourself, not just your trust in them, your trust in your own perception, your own judgment, your own emotional reactions. You may find yourself thinking, how did I not see this sooner? Why did I stay? Why did I keep forgiving? And if you're not careful, that self-questioning turns into self-blame. But here's the truth. You stayed because you were empathetic. You forgave because you believe in growth. You tried because you value commitment. Those are not flaws. Those are strengths that were exploited. Healing requires you to reframe that narrative. You are not foolish for loving deeply. You are not weak for hoping. You are not naive for believing someone's words. But now your task is to turn that empathy inward. Therapy can be transformative here, not because you're broken, but because having a neutral, validating space to unpack the gaslighting, the projection, the confusion is incredibly stabilizing. When someone calmly says, no, that behavior was not healthy, something inside you begins to realign. You stop questioning your reality. You begin rebuilding self-trust, but therapy is just one piece. Healing also looks like reconnecting with safe people, the friends you may have drifted from, the family members who noticed something was off, the support systems that don't require you to shrink. Isolation is a hallmark of narcissistic dynamics, sometimes overtly, sometimes subtly. You become so focused on managing the relationship that other connections fade. Reclaiming those connections reminds you of who you are outside the chaos. And then there's the quiet work, journaling, sitting with your thoughts, identifying patterns, asking yourself difficult but empowering questions. What were the early red flags? What did I ignore? Where did I override my intuition? Not to shame yourself, but to strengthen your awareness moving forward. Because healing is not just about recovering from the past, it's about preparing for the future. Narcissistic dynamics can distort your internal compass. You may become overly accommodating in new relationships, or conversely, hyper-defensive. You may struggle with trust. You may fear conflict. You may over-explain your needs. That's trauma residue, and it softens with intentional work. Self-care in this context is not bubble baths and vacations, though those are lovely. It's boundaries. It's saying no without a paragraph of justification. It's noticing when your body tenses and asking why. It's choosing environments that feel calm rather than chaotic. It's rebuilding a life that feels steady. And I want to address something very important. Healing is not linear. There will be days when you feel strong and clear, and there will be days when you miss them. When you remember the good moments, when you doubt your decision, when loneliness whispers that maybe it wasn't that bad. That doesn't mean you're regressing. It means you're human. Trauma bonds are powerful. They don't dissolve overnight. But each time you choose self-respect over nostalgia, you strengthen your recovery. Each time you honor your boundary, even when it's uncomfortable, you rebuild your confidence. Each time you resist the urge to re-enter the chaos just to feel something familiar, you reclaim your agency, and over time, something remarkable happens. Your baseline changes. You no longer feel drawn to intensity masquerading as passion. You no longer confuse unpredictability with excitement. You begin to crave consistency, kindness, emotional safety. You raise your standards, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. You begin to understand that love should not feel like survival. And perhaps most powerfully, you stop measuring your healing by whether they notice. You don't need them to apologize for you to move forward. You don't need them to admit fault for your experience to be valid. You don't need closure from someone who thrives in ambiguity. Closure becomes internal. It becomes the moment you say, I deserve better, and mean it. It becomes the moment you choose peace over proximity. It becomes the moment you trust yourself again. And here's something I want you to hold on to. The ultimate revenge, if we even want to use that word, is not proving anything to them. It's not outshining them. It's not making them regret losing you. It's becoming so grounded, so self-trusting, so emotionally independent that their chaos no longer defines your world. It's building a life where your nervous system is not constantly on edge. It's waking up without bracing. It's loving without fear. When you invest in your healing, you break the cycle, not just for yourself, but for anyone watching you, children, friends, family. You model that self-respect is non-negotiable. You model that boundaries are healthy. You model that walking away from harm is strength. And as you heal, something beautiful emerges: compassion without self-sacrifice, empathy without self-erasure, strength without hostility. You become whole again. And when you are whole, you no longer tolerate dynamics that require you to fracture. Your healing is your power. And the moment you choose yourself consistently is the moment the cycle truly ends.